The swamp beckons. The wings of the abandoned mills on the marshes are constantly turning, and smoke is coming out of their chimneys. Everyone who lives nearby bypasses these mills. The sounds the swamp makes sound like the talk of a giant living creature. And the wandering lights in the swamps are often mistaken by lonely travelers for dwelling lights and head straight for the swamps. Because of the characteristic location of the lights, at the height of a human hand, they were called dead man's candles. It was believed that those who saw them received a warning of imminent death, and they were carried by aliens from beyond the world. In Germany, it was said that the lights in the swamp were the ghosts of those who stole land from their neighbors. The Finns called them Likyo and believed they were the souls of children buried in the woods. In Northern Europe, it was believed that the lights in the swamp were the spirits of ancient warriors guarding the treasures. I myself grew up in the north and, consequently, spent my entire youth at the dacha gathering mushrooms and berries, including in the swamps, and I can say that even in the daytime you can shit your pants in them. 1. The easiest thing is to get lost in an open area of the swamp. The whole point is that you forget where you came from and what direction leads out. Once I got lost, and did not recognize the forest area at all, in which I hiked regularly for 5 years, and which has a bunch of tags from other woodsmen. I wandered so for about 10 hours. To say I was scared is nothing. Not a summer goes by where someone does not go missing in the marshes. 2. Among the marshes, sometimes lakes of swamp water form. On one of them I fish every summer, and once I had a chance to see how something with copper shiny scaly skin, apparently, dragged an adult duck under the water. 3. If you fall asleep in the swamp, you have a 90% chance of seeing interesting dreams. I haven't tried it myself, as I don't want to take the risk. 4. I once drank the swamp water and caught serious food poisoning. According to my relatives, I had been in a delirium for several days, begged them to drown me, so that I could go home. As I recovered, my grandmother almost forced me to go to church with her. My teacher at the institute wanted to organize an expedition to the marshes in the Arkhangelsk region. On Google Maps, he found some fucking thing there that was incomprehensible, in places where there were no people at all. He made inquiries somewhere, and they told him to go. I do not know how it ended, but the maps did show some kind of pyramids or temples. They were small, the size of an ordinary building. He was a professor of geology in Krasnoyarsk. He had a dissertation about finding minerals with the help of satellites, like helicopter reconnaissance. I was in my 4th year when we had his class. He was in one of his classes at the end of the semester and he started talking about it. He showed me one picture, from the satellite. Of course, there was a river flood or swamp, and along the bank were seen 3 small rhombuses. As he said, they don't know what they are. It might well be some old structure, but there were solid swamps all around that area. The nearest settlement was hundreds of kilometers away. There was no way to get there by transport. He said he made inquiries to the local military units. They said that it was not theirs. He planned to organize an expedition there, but he could not find sponsors. A year later I found out that he had quit. I have a story about an acquaintance of ours whom we don't see very often. And the reason is his exotic job. He studies gases in the marshes. Their composition, structure, conditions of formation. It's quite a job. To be alone in the marshes is not easy psychologically, and at the same time to conduct scientific research, makes for a demanding job. But our acquaintance is a surprisingly calm and focused man. Naturally, when he came into my field of vision, I tortured him with questions about the horrors of the marshes. Swamp monsters. Blah, blah. To which he calmly answered me, I've never encountered anything like that. Sounds of swamp gases, birds' voices, nothing out of the ordinary. The subject quickly died down. But not long ago, in the company of one another, nestled on the terrace, we were chatting about life. He finished his work on the marshes, the material was typed, and it was time for boring laboratory work at home. And then he thoughtfully said,
Remember, we were talking about bugs? The strange and incomprehensible.
I nodded without interrupting. He continued,
I said then that I had never encountered anything abnormal. I was being sarcastic. I had. More than once, more than twice. All sorts of things.
Like you were gonna start spouting monster stories now? I said with a chuckle, but, without a shadow of a smile. My friend told me that in his situation, when he worked for a specific employer, it would be reckless to talk about all sorts of swamp horrors. The people there are experienced, they understand very well the conditions under which the work takes place and carefully monitor the psychological state of their workers.
A rumor about strange behavior is enough, You won't get anywhere else and lose good money. Well, it is quieter, if you just turn a blind eye to the incomprehensible and work. But this is lyrical.
What did our scientist encounter? Unintelligible and strange noises. Oh yes, as much as you like. Swamp gases are escaping, and this process is accompanied by very strange, to the human ear, sounds. The crackling of rotting trees. As night falls, it takes on an altogether darker hue. There have been several times when the sounds were really strange. Once, in the middle of the night, there was a woman's sobbing cry, which turned smoothly into a howl, reached the highest note, and suddenly cut off. On another occasion it was a child's laughter that suddenly changed tone, and the laughter became like a man's. Quite frightening. Although the nature of this may be in the peculiarities of our mind's perception of the same sounds of gases coming to the surface. I would like to believe it. Once an acquaintance, changing the place of dislocation for the installation of devices, saw a house on a small island in the middle of the marsh. Old and rusty, but house, nonetheless. Even with a scarecrow. And it was unbelievable and made no sense. They don't build hunting lodges in places like this. Well, there is a scarecrow in the swamp. For who though? Then there are the wandering lights, too, yes. But they are explained again by gases and phosphorus coming to the surface from rotting animal bodies. In general, these places are clearly not where you would like to have a cottage. According to my acquaintance, swamps are quite safe. The main thing is to know what you can do and what not to do. And one of the rules for him was, when faced with the unknown, never try to figure out its nature. Just act as if you didn't notice anything. A couple of times our scientist heard something huge approaching his camp on a patch of dense earth, making squelching, crunching footsteps. It was frightening, and it was only an effort of will that he forced himself not to jump out of the tent and run like hell. The sound faded just before the tent. I marvel at that man's courage. I would have already built a fence around the tent out of stakes, like in the game, The Forest. He had an uncomfortable moment just before he left for home. For 2 hours he was catching glances with his peripheral vision of some kind of mass. And on top of that, his trail, on which he leaned to cross the most waterlogged areas, ripped out of his hands. Swamps are not a pleasant place. Just you. And the swamp. Alone with nature. Sometimes I go to my relatives in the village, to my grandmother, aunt, and uncle. There used to be a cousin and a grandfather, but the brother grew up long ago and moved to the Moscow region, and the grandfather died 10 years ago. Grandma's house is on the edge of the forest swamp, which stretches for tens of kilometers around. The swamp is surrounded on almost all sides by forest. I have often seen over the swamps, wandering lights. It looks very beautiful, especially if there is a night fog. As a child, my brother and I often used to run into the swamp looking for mushrooms. They're not so easy to find. Sometimes you go over the bumps for an hour or two, tired already, and then suddenly, there it is, growing, soft green, fresh, on the mounds, around trees or old stumps. There is even an underwater mushroom. You can put your hand into the swamp and feel the tickle on your arm. It makes you want to dive into it. It's unmistakable. My grandma said once there were such mushrooms growing near the village. The locals picked them so often they begun to sprout deeper in the swamp. I remember that I even spent nights with my brother in the swamp once in a while trying to look for these mushrooms. Back then we were in the 90s, it was somehow easier for my family to take it all. But now I think about it and it's scary how you can let your kids go anywhere these days. Although sometimes we would sneak off at night to the swamp. By the way, my brother talked about certain mushrooms which would glow at night, and the stalks of which could be eaten. To do this, he used to take a pile of them and start roasting them. That's what my grandmother taught us. Once it worked, and the stalk tasted good, but more often, of course, it didn't work. The stalk would turn black and start blubbering. The cap itself was bitter and yellow transparent, with red streaks. No matter how much we tried it, it did not get any better tasting. My grandmother and grandfather knew how to make it, but they had enough to do at that time instead of wading through the swamps with us. Also, the mushrooms helped against that swamp hum. You know, as if the air vibrates, as if something hums from below. The deeper into the marshes we went, the more palpable it felt, as if a huge transformer worked. So, if you focus on the mushrooms, you stop noticing it. Or rather, you perceive the hum less, and somehow you feel joy in your soul. You even want to sing. So, we used to stand in the early morning and sing. It was the song of the marshes. And then, in the evening, we'd come home with the spoils of our outing. I hadn't been out on the marshes in a long time now, more than 10 years. I hadn't seen my brother in about the same time. Adult life makes its changes, all the good and bright things are often left behind. What do you know about the
Arkhangelsk
taiga? I bet the first things that come to mind are marshes, cranberries, and Lomonosov and his fish train. I'll tell you a couple of stories that I remembered the other day. Going through my old papers, I have a pretty bad habit of storing everything, from letters to tax receipts, sort of like an archive without a purpose. Thankfully, there's almost no files on duty now, and I can arrange them in a relatively legible way. I reread old letters from my aunt in a village in the Arkhangelsk region, where I used to go as a little rascal and when older. As a matter of fact, the last time I was there was about 3 years ago. I went to help my aunt with the move, but it did not end up happening, so I had to do small household chores, repair various village equipment. Looks like the fucking electrician came to the village, and drink with the locals. The men in the village, however, were those who have traversed with a lantern through the swamps, and in exchange for some delicious homemade moonshine, they got an appreciative listener of delightful village stories. Especially grandfather Rayok, aka Nikolai Lukich, stood out, who, in spite of his seriously retired age and habit to indulge in alcohol, kept his lively mind and quite healthy memory. If you get over the first impression, of course, because outwardly he looked like an aged cop from the movie, Cargo 200. A colorful granddad, in short. Grandpa Beam was born in a remote part of Arkhangelsk, farther south where there wasn't even electricity, a village council and a church. As usual for that area, all these goods of civilization were in the villages closer to the center of the rural settlement, the largest village in the county. The villages there are still located along the local rivers, of which there are hundreds in the region. If the villages deepened from the river into the woods, they invariably became smaller, the roads to them were worse, the people in them darker and more unfriendly. Onion was born in one such forest village, Lower
Voydanga.
You won't find this village, by the way, like hundreds like it, in the records. All the census enumerators were fucked by the abundance of local toponyms and the fact that there could be 5 or 7 villages with the same name within 100 yards, so the settlements were listed under a new name, for example,
Filimonovka.
rural settlement. The locals clearly divided their villages under their old names within the settlement, which made all sorts of government officials fuck up repeatedly. Grandpa Rayok willingly told about his small homeland.
Nizhnyaya Voydanga
Is an old village, and it always stood by the rivulet, but over the years the rivulet has grown shallow and marshy. Now we are left with logging, fishing for berries and mushrooms. The marshes burned down Voydanga as far back as during the Tsarist regime. The local fool beaver went to the swamps to get moss to mend the house for the winter, but he brought back bad moss. According to Luca's story, it's like regular swamp moss, only blue and smells like hay from the mowing. If they found a little bit of it, they would gather it, dry it, and trade with Nenets and Komi, but if they came across a clearing of bad moss, they marked it 100 paces away and didn't come closer. It did not spread widely, and on the marshes they were easily oriented by the marks of their great-great-grandfathers. Otherwise, you couldn't get out of such glades. As far as I understood from the stories, if a beast, a cattle, or a stranger came into the marsh, it would release spores or gas, which would cause paralysis. And here the bobblehead had mashed up the hut for the winter with this kind of moss. The next summer it turned out that even if the villagers recognized the mistake, they did not have time to burn this hut. Or they couldn't. Or, which now seems more likely to me, did not want to. I had to work for them in
Nizhnyavoydansk.
Who told about the trouble by the round trippers. They found the place of the neighboring village. There were only log cabins overgrown with sherds and heavy, thick smell of haymaking, although the grass had just risen. They grieved the peasants, and burned everything they reached there, having surrounded the former village with 12.5 yards with dead wood entrenched in a circle with a furrow. What's left are the ruins and a ring of ashes and the name. The authorities have never been particularly interested in the affairs of the locals, and as for the locals themselves, it was perceived there as a harsh reality, that's for sure. They dug up the road to Voydanga, tried not to walk that way and not to graze the cattle from that side. Things would have gone on the same old way at Lower Voydanga if it were not for one incident from our more familiar 20th century, which was witnessed by Rayok himself. In the first post-war years, the roundup workers brought 3 geologists in the summer. Or not geologists, but those who study the area for industrial development of peatlands. I will call them geologists. The villagers took them in, lodged them with Luca and Luca's father. The point is that the next day the geologists went to the bogs. They refused a guide, evidently were afraid of him. It is possible to understand them, local people, as they told, were not too hospitable. They were told not to go in the direction of
Voydanga.
if they wanted to come back. As best as the villagers could, they explained what happened to that village. But then, it turned out that it was in vain. Geologists assumed that the villagers wanted to hide something from them and hence brought the Soviet authorities there. They have collected bags and tools and have moved forward just in the direction of the Ashen Circle. The locals did not try to dissuade them.
On the third day, one of the geologists was found on the edge of the village. They were looking for a pig that undermined the fence and ran away to the forest edge. Torn by branches, covered with blue fur of the same bad marsh moss and blind, he was groping through the swamps for 2 days. The men were summoned, and Beam, then a 10-year-old boy, was with them.
Almost 70 years later he would tell how his father Luka washed off the mangled geologist with kerosene from the village, how the women were told to heat the sauna and rake out the coals to put the poor man there. The men themselves, equipped with kerosene, stakes and ropes, went to rescue the remaining 2 explorers. They reached the ashes, then already overgrown, in half a day's walk.
We were the first to smell the haymaking, then we saw a grey-blue carpet in a ring of dried-up, unseasonable grass. No trees, no bushes.
Beam vividly described the clearing, oppressively calm and flat, except for 2 mossy bumps, or as if a tree was broken in half. The bump or stump, which was higher, swayed faintly. It was the one that was pulled out of the clearing with a rope. No mistake, it was one of the geologists. They found, in short, what they were trying to hide from them. The geologist was still alive, wheezing through the crust of moss that densely covered his entire body, even under his clothes. They dragged him away from the marshes clearing and tried to clean his face. The small roots of the moss had to be torn right out of the softened pale skin. When they removed the layer of moss from his mouth, the wheezing became a little more intelligible. The geologist was trying to say something. Grandpa Ray could only make out the words, "God is in the swamp, God's light is there, and God let me in." Then the geologist suddenly tried to get up, fell down, tried to crawl, but fell asleep before the men got out of their stupor. He was then burned on dead wood, which, like a couple of centuries ago, encircled the gray patch of the clearing. The last geologist survived. He lost his eyes, and a leg was cut off by Luka himself with a saw, because moss got into his boot and ate much of the flesh there. A cross-country vehicle came to pick up the geologists a month later. They explained to them what had happened and accompanied them to the site of the accident. Another month later, soldiers came in trucks. The soldiers stayed, while the trucks took all the sparse population of
Voydanga.
first to Plesetsk, where the Cosmodrome and the city of Plesetsk are located now, and then they settled in the south of the region, ordering them not to spread. That's how Luka and his father ended up in the village with his aunt. He first got a job at a school, then at a timber company, and then retired, making moonshine and telling bizarre stories. I have always been fascinated by swamps. The smooth, algae-covered surface of the standing water is indistinguishable from solid ground, and it seems to beckon you to step on it. You take just one step, and you're already going to the bottom. The silence, pervaded in the warm still air, is broken only by the soft rustling of reeds and rare chirping of insects. Complete peace reigns here, which is if pressing down on you with a pleasant weight, persuading you also to sink into slumber. Sometimes I imagine myself as a kind of mysterious creature, one of those that people usually imagine when they think of creatures living in the depths of the marshes. I, myself, cannot exactly describe my appearance. I only know that it cannot be defined by one word, like terrible, ugly or grotesque. Rather, it has exactly those traits that are characteristic of a swamp dweller, making its wearer resemble the very place it inhabits. I have a bulky body that resembles a fallen trunk of a massive tree, covered with moss and marsh plants that seem to grow out of it, and I move on many paws, perhaps 6, 8, or even more. My footsteps are heavy, rumbling, slow, leaving trails of silt and sludge behind me as I crawl lazily out of the swamp to hunt in peace on the bank of my swamp. Sometimes I just devour all sorts of small critters sniffing around the water, sometimes I pretend to be a bog mound waiting for a bigger animal to step on me, mistaking me for a foothold. Then I grab it by the leg and, again, leisurely, drag it to the bottom. I rarely eat, so I spend most of my life in the swamp, sleeping, and my breathing can sometimes be heard by random travelers who approach the swamp carelessly. Every day, my visions become more and more threatening. At the very moment when the line between reality and dream is blurred, I begin to hear the swamp call. Indescribable horror creeps into my mind, but my weakened consciousness, unable to resist the witchy sound, begins to slip out of my body, sinking into the viscous, stinking swamp. Gasping for air, I desperately resist the nightmarish flood, but the soulless mechanism inexorably pulls me into its depths. At the limit of my meager abilities, I make one last, desperate dash toward the surface. I don't know how, but I still manage to surface from that devilish whirlpool, pulling me deeper and deeper into its bottomless depths. When I opened my eyes wide, I found myself up to my neck in a festering mire, from beneath which pillars of foul-smelling miasmas were erupting with disgusting sounds, either clucking or gurgling, and blowing the lifeless wasteland with the breath of centuries-old decay. The only thing I could see was the vast marshland rot, over which the deep-sea fog slid like a heavy river, with the occasional bluish flames of the unlived souls that were stuck here forever, never awake. Overcoming crushing bouts of revulsion, I begin to move along the muddy bottom. As I bogged down in the musty peat deposits, I often came across solid objects, shaped like joints, rods, and valves, many of which shrank in a strange, irrational sequence. I can only guess how long I wandered, waist-deep in the unbearably disgusting mud, until my ears were attracted to some rhythmic sound, reminiscent of millstone blades touching, as they rotated, the rancid, gelatinous surface of the water. Soon I saw an object that looked like a huge, toothed wheel, the color of caked blood. In that second I had the thought that even noble metal could not resist this realm of decay and corrosion, which spread out over every conceivable length, like a god-forsaken boil, over the body of this unhappy land. I continued to move toward the mysterious cog, which was astonishing in its truly titanic proportions, pushing up and down the rusty pistons and pipes sticking out like the fossilized members of some gigantic scolopendrium. As I approached the absurd mechanism, I began to hear a wrenching rumble from beneath the ground, as if it were the muffled moans of countless drowned men, buried alive in the thickness of a fermented muddy nightmare. The growing demonic sound made me shiver with unaccountable terror. I shuddered at the thought of what might be lurking beneath the cover of the decaying bed sores. Suddenly a huge hole opened before me, from which a torrent of dark brown treasure burst forth in a mighty rush, so red-hot that even a single drop, accidentally falling on my leg, was enough to burn it down to the bone. I howled in pain and stumbled backward, but when I looked toward the gaping hole, I saw something so foreign and contrary to human nature that writing about it now would be an ordeal for me. I would gladly remove the parts of my brain that store the memory of those moments, but before the Lord of the Swamp mechanisms consumes my soul, I must describe everything that happened that day. I saw in that black, rapidly tightening vortex something that only vaguely resembled forms known to mankind. The first thing that came to my attention was an amorphous conglomeration of swirling, foaming, and violently hissing pieces of rotting carcass, emitting an unspeakable stench, as if connected by metal devices beyond my comprehension, akin to an insanely twisted homunculus created as a mockery of all that we believe in. Distorted in every possible dimension, it is like a multidimensional object that can only be perceived by our limited consciousness from the perspective of a three-dimensional being. In addition, this mind-bending creature did not stop undergoing countless metamorphoses, so that its image had a special, narcotic connotation. It seemed to me that some giant cadaver worms had grown in place of its supposed shoes, which immediately became curling, spiraling shells, only to change its appearance again. I cannot comprehend the true nature of this unspeakable creature, but I could feel its gaze scrutinizing me with its piercing, chilling, yet soul-burning eyes, the size of cyclopean portholes, which remained unchanged throughout our meeting. It was as if, with its gaze, it desecrated the very life that had created such a thing. The unknown monster watched me until the vortex completely collapsed, leaving me alone with the giant spinning wheel, which was surely only a tiny fraction of what it was built for. I couldn't move, my fear so overpowering that it was as if I were trapped forever in these throbbing clots of flesh, woven and held together by indescribable technological devices. Hysterical laughter involuntarily erupted from my throat, and I shuddered in fits of insane laughter. I seemed not to laugh, but to resonate with the hideous howl of the sirens, coming from beneath the earth, which grew like the approaching peals of thunder, before the true storm that would mix all things into the disgusting stinking mess that possessed my consciousness. My mind finally broke down, and not ceasing to laugh wildly, I ran into the depths of the black mud, hoping that it would forever hide my soul from this embodied horror, because if God gave all creatures the spark of life, this thing was devoid of any manifestation of spirituality. It was a true nightmare, which should not exist either in our or in any other dimensions. My body shuddered in wild convulsions, and I roared uncontrollably like a madman. I couldn't tell when the image of the apartment, the ceiling, the walls, appeared in my head. My emptiness was somewhat otherworldly. There was a feeling that I was dead, still there, but the empty shell continued to function on the principle of a soulless mechanism. This analogy made me gag. My body was so exhausted that I could hardly breathe. I wiped the cold sweat from my forehead and stared blankly into the void. After lying like that for a while, I pulled myself off the bed with a tremendous effort, and when I went into the bathroom, I was horrified at how painful my face looked. My eyes had sunk a few centimeters, and the bruises beneath them described a dark circle going toward my ears. My hair was now covered in extensive gray patches. I looked at the dial. It was exactly half an hour after I went to bed. But right now, I didn't care about such trivialities, like the obvious discrepancy in the time intervals. Anyway, no matter how crazy my dream is, it's just an illusion, a delusional hallucination. It went through my skull. I was relieved at that moment. I stood in front of the mirror for a while and decided to take a bath, but before I was completely undressed, I discovered one fateful detail that finally drove my lapsed mind from this mortal body. On my left foot, there was a crimson burgundy ulcer, through which I could see the tendons that had eaten through, and the bones white as toadstools. The skin at the edges of the tear was as withered as a withered aspen leaf. If you're reading these lines, don't waste your time searching in vain for my body, you won't find it. I hear the call of the swamps, and in them I am destined for eternal oblivion, because nothing in the world will hide me from this creature in my sleep, except the black, rotten silt.